Today is Sunday, July 12th, 2026, and today is National Pecan Pie Day, which seems like a holiday that accidentally wandered away from Thanksgiving. But honestly, I'm not going to argue with an extra excuse to eat pecan pie. But after digging through today's stories, I noticed they all had something in common. They're really about people whose impact reached much farther than you might expect. One became the face of an entire nation. Another spent decades fighting a force no one could control. And one quietly helped create a hero almost everyone on Earth recognizes. Sometimes the biggest influence belongs to the people behind the story. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your reasonably calm guide through humanity's long history of strange decisions. On July 12, 1917, the now famous slogan, "Uncle Sam Wants You," made one of its earliest appearances as the United States ramped up recruitment during World War I. Even if you've never studied its history, you've almost certainly seen the image. An older man with a white goatee, a star-spangled top hat, a stern expression, and one finger pointing directly at you. It's one of the most recognizable recruiting posters ever created. The artwork, illustrated by James Montgomery Flagg, wasn't subtle. It wasn't supposed to be. Instead of speaking to a crowd, it spoke to one person at a time. You. That simple choice made the message feel personal. The image became an icon almost overnight and has been copied, parodied, and reimagined countless times ever since. What's interesting is that Uncle Sam himself was already an established American symbol before the poster existed. The recruiting campaign simply gave him the face most of us still picture today. Sometimes one image can redefine an idea for generations. Of course, some forces can't be persuaded by a poster, or negotiated with, or even slowed down. On July 12, 1993, the Great Flood of 1993 reached record levels along the Mississippi River. This wasn't a flood that lasted a weekend, or even a week. Heavy rains had been falling across the Midwest for months. Rivers kept rising. Levees failed. Entire communities disappeared beneath the water. It became one of the largest and most expensive natural disasters in American history. I actually remember this one. My normal drive to work was underwater. For weeks, I had to drive about 20 miles out of the way just to get there. But compared to what many people experience, that was a minor inconvenience. Thousands of families lost homes. Businesses closed. Farmland disappeared beneath floodwater. Entire towns spent weeks fighting to hold back a river that simply refused to cooperate. One thing I find remarkable about disasters like this is how quickly ordinary people become extraordinary. Neighbors filled sandbags. Volunteers showed up from hundreds of miles away. Communities worked around the clock because there really wasn't another option. Sometimes history remembers the disaster. I think it should also remember the people who helped each other through it. And our final story is about someone who spent decades helping create one of the most famous heroes in the world, without most people ever knowing his name. On July 12, 1937, artist Bob Kane first began collaborating with a young writer named Bill Finger. At the time, neither of them could have imagined they were helping create one of the most recognizable fictional characters in history. Most people know Batman. Far fewer know Bill Finger. And that's one of the great ironies of comic book history. Bob Kane is often credited with creating Batman, but Finger's contributions shaped nearly everything we recognize today. The original concept looked very different. Finger suggested the dark cowl instead of a domino mask. The cape, the gloves, the mysterious detective persona. He came up with the name Bruce Wayne. He helped create Gotham City, Robin, the Joker, the Batmobile, the Batcave. In other words, many of the elements people immediately associate with Batman came from Bill Finger's imagination. For decades, though, his name was largely absent from the credits. While Batman became one of the world's biggest superheroes, Finger remained almost completely unknown outside the comic book industry. It wasn't until many years after his death that DC Comics officially began crediting Batman as being created by Bob Kane with Bill Finger. I've always found that story both inspiring and a little bittersweet. It's a reminder that history sometimes remembers the creation before it remembers the creator. And looking back across today's stories, they all remind us that influence isn't always measured by recognition. An illustration gave a nation a face. Ordinary people came together during an extraordinary disaster. A writer helped create a cultural icon while remaining largely invisible. And that brings us to someone who never seemed interested in being the center of attention. He wanted the people around him to feel like the stars. Born on July 12, 1948, Richard Simmons became one of the most recognizable fitness personalities in America. Bright tank tops, sparkling shorts, an endless supply of energy. He certainly knew how to get people's attention. Underneath all that enthusiasm was a remarkably simple mission. He wanted ordinary people to believe they could improve their lives. Not professional athletes, not fitness models, everyone. At a time when many exercise programs felt intimidating or exclusive, Simmons made fitness feel welcoming. He celebrated every small victory. He encouraged people who often felt overlooked. And he answered thousands of letters and phone calls from fans who simply needed someone to believe in them. That's the part of his legacy I admire most. The workouts mattered, but making people feel seen mattered even more. And looking back across today's stories, I kept thinking about the people behind the headlines. The artist whose image became America's most famous recruiting poster. The volunteers and neighbors who quietly held communities together during one of the worst floods in U.S. history. Bill Finger, whose imagination helped shape Batman long before his name received the recognition it deserves. And Richard Simmons, who spent decades reminding people they were worth encouraging. History often celebrates the biggest moments, but sometimes it's the people working quietly behind them who leave the deepest mark. Anyway, that's what I found while exploring July 12th. I'll leave you with today's oddly appropriate quote. No act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Aesop. If you'd like to hear more of my work, audiobooks, or other projects I've somehow gotten myself involved in, you can find everything over at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and honestly, thank you for spending a little time being curious with me. I'll see you tomorrow.